A Spanish place in the sun could become a lot more expensive for non-EU residents. Spain's Prime Minister is proposing a 100% tax for those buying property from outside the European Union. Will this help fix the country's housing crisis, or will it drive away investment? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, Spain's Prime Minister says the move to penalise non-EU property buyers is necessary to meet the country's housing emergency. Pedro Sanchez says there's too many people buying properties to make money from rather than live in. But can he get Parliament to approve this unprecedented new tax?
The dream of owning a Spanish property in the sun for non-EU citizens could be at risk. Spain's Prime Minister is planning a 100% tax on properties bought by mainly Britons, but also Moroccans, Russians and Americans.
In this moment of crisis we are living in, and with millions of civilians suffering, there are too many Airbnbs and not enough houses.
Spain is in the midst of a housing crisis driven by the rising cost of living, with rents increasing 80% over the past decade. Property sales to foreign buyers from all countries increased from around 20,000 16 years ago to around 90,000 in 2023. Whether the Prime Minister's minority coalition can pass the tax penalty in Parliament is uncertain. But they did vote to end the country's golden visa scheme, coming into effect this April. The visa allowed non-EU citizens to live and work in Spain in exchange for investment. Last year, locals in popular Spanish cities and resorts protested over the growth of mass tourism. In response, officials in Barcelona decided to eliminate all short-term rentals in the city by 2028. But those who work in the tourism industry don't agree with the blame being put on them.
I don't think we're guilty of inflating the prices of housing. In Madrid, for example, there's a lack of supply and a lot of demand.
Will the 100% tax prioritise homes for Spaniards, or will it damage Spain's reputation as a major travel destination?
So let's meet our guests. In Marbella, in the south of Spain, we have real estate lawyer Alex Radford. In Copenhagen, we have Stephen Abletshauser. He's an advisor specialising in international private wealth. In Tenerife, in the Canary Islands, Brian Harrison from the Save La Tejita campaign group. And here in the studio with me, we have Pablo Calderon Martinez. He's Associate Professor in Politics and International Relations. That's at Northeastern University in London. You're all very welcome to Roundtable. Pablo, I'll come to you first of all. This is certainly one way of solving a housing crisis. How are Spanish people feeling?
Well, there's certainly one way to try to solve the housing crisis. We don't know if it's going to work yet. And I think Pedro Sanchez was very clear in saying that there is no silver bullet. And this is a problem that's been building up for quite some time now, probably since the 2008 financial crisis. So it's not going to be easy to solve. But I think overall, people in Spain want a solution, and I think it is the main political issue of the time, certainly domestically. And I think Pedro Sanchez is trying to solve what is pretty much at the top of the priorities of many Spanish voters at the moment in time. If it works or not, only time will tell, but I think at least it's a step in the right direction. It's a step to try to solve the issue, and we'll have to wait and see if it works.
Brian, to you in the Canaries, I don't know about you, but one of my favourite English TV shows involves real estate agents taking British people, mostly to Spain, to look at lovely villas and apartments, and then you follow their journey and which one they buy at the end of it. That dream is going to end for an awful lot of British people now, isn't it?
Well, it's not going to end for anybody who's a resident. If anyone wants to apply for residency, if they live here, then they've got the same right to buy a property as any Spanish person. So it's only going to affect somebody who doesn't live here or doesn't have an intention of living here. So essentially, it's saying that a luxury option of owning a property you can't live in is made more complicated and more expensive.
And tell me, Brian, do you feel British potential purchasers are being scapegoated maybe a bit for Spain's housing crisis?
Absolutely not. this measure, this proposal, only affects non-EU citizens. So it could be somebody from Russia, from China, from any other part in the world than the European Union. It's definitely not against British citizens.
Let's bring Alex in. Alex, what's this going to do to your business?
Well, that's a very good question. And I mean, basically, at the moment, we don't know for sure what Pedro Sanchez's proposals actually mean. He said he wants to increase taxes on the purchase of property by 100%. I've seen some silly headlines from newspapers in the UK, for example, that said that a house that cost you 400k is now going to cost you 800,000, double the amount. That's not true. So at the moment, we don't know what taxes actually will be applied. The regional governments in Spain apply the purchase tax for second-hand properties. So Pedro Sanchez can't touch those taxes, but he could perhaps introduce a brand new tax on the purchase of second-hand property or off-plan property. So we act for clients from all over the world, Europeans and non-Europeans, buying property in Spain. And what this does to the real estate market is it brings a lot of uncertainty. So actually, at the moment, what we're seeing is our non-European buyers are accelerating their plans to purchase. And then we've got to wait and see what actually, we've got to see the devil in the detail.
So in a strange way, Alex, you're seeing more business maybe immediately off the back of this news and all the headlines?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, we're acting for clients. So the television show you referred to earlier, we are participants in the exhibitions in the UK, and we talk to British buyers about buying holiday homes and moving to Spain, and we help them with their residencies and visas. So at the moment, everyone who's on the train, so to speak, are still continuing with their journey because we don't know when these taxes will be introduced, what form they'll take, and to be honest, if they'll be introduced at all, because Pedro Sanchez has a very small, slender majority in the Spanish parliament. Last week, he tried to introduce 3 laws, and only one of those actually got passed. So it is a question of wait and see, and I don't think this is a done deal yet.
Stephen, to you work with a lot of high net worth individuals, very wealthy people. I'm guessing they'll just look at France and Italy and think, well, let's just buy there instead.
To some degree, I agree. Notwithstanding what Alex says, the tax is not yet introduced. We don't know how that's going to work out. But the likes of Greece, Italy, Turkey, which also have preferential tax regimes, will seem even more attractive compared to Spain.
And tell me, how much has this exercised people's thoughts then since it started hitting the news? Because it's generated, as you've seen, a lot of headlines around Europe.
I think people are feeling put off. It's not just about the devil in the detail, as Alex says, about the actual law itself. It's about the feeling. And there have, of course, been some anti-tourist demonstrations and similar populist outcries against tourists themselves. So I think overall it's beginning to make people feel less welcome than they had been before.
Pablo, just on that point, I mean, Spain relies heavily on tourism. It's quite a fine walk here for Sanchez because ultimately his Spanish electorate, they want housing, but the Spanish economy needs all this money coming in.
Yes, but it depends where in Spain you're talking about and who you're talking about in that particular constituency. So there are a lot of parts in Spain, particularly the cities in particular, the bigger cities, where the housing crisis is a real big issue. And Pedro Sanchez has to do something to solve that problem. And a lot of these big cities maybe do not rely as heavily on tourism as some of the other more tourist-specific towns and areas. But I think it's a targeted measure specifically to target people, particularly short rentals and all these short rentals that really drive up the prices of housing across bigger cities. So I think it's an important measure. I do think more than the tax itself, I do think is a message that it sends. And the message that it sends is, and I think Pedro Sanchez said as much, Spanish housing should be primarily for Spanish people, and then whatever is left, it should go to tourism. But yes, tourism is very important for Spain, for sure, but it's not like it was 40 years ago when it was the main industry, the main economic activity for Spain. The Spanish economy is very diversified. There's a lot of other economic activities. Important though it may be, I think Pedro Sanchez has to look at the preferences and the priorities of the electorate, and housing is without a doubt at the very top of that.
Brian, I know you've been living in the Canaries for quite a long time and you've assimilated, you have friends and you're part of the community there and you do campaign work. Talk me through what life in the Canaries will be like then without British buyers for the property market, without all that UK tourism coming in.
Well, firstly, if I may, just a bit of background to the situation here for Canarian people, Spanish people who live on the island. Historically, people have emigrated away from islands for work, for poverty. For the first time in history, people are emigrating from the islands for lack of housing. And that's an important point. It's so severe that even talking about the economy, small businesses who rely on waiters and catering staff and kitchen staff are closing. A lot of small businesses are actually closing because they can't find staff. The reason there's no staff in these areas is because the people who work in these kind of jobs can't find housing. There was an incident where a person who can't be named because of data protection purchased, a foreign person, purchased 500 properties in Tenerife and immediately converted them into property rentals, into holiday rentals. Obviously, this is having a huge impact upon the area.
Alex, to you, is this part of the problem then that we've hit upon investors coming in, one guy buying up 500 properties? I mean, you can see why Spanish people are getting very, very upset.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't been fortunate to act for that person buying the 500 properties, but what I have read in the press recently is that you've got to go back to 2013, okay, and there was a massive the property bubble and market burst. The Conservative government at the time introduced the Golden Visa program, which Pedro Sanchez is also withdrawing. And, the banks are the biggest landowners of property in Spain. So Spain wanted foreigners to come in and buy all this surplus property, which is what has happened. And you've got to remember that when someone buys a second-hand property in Spain, they pay transfer tax. And those taxes range from 6.5% to 10%, depending on where you buy in Spain. What have the authorities been doing with that money? Have they been reinvesting it back in housing? Obviously not. So there are isolated incidents that Brian is talking about, but I would say most of our clients, Europeans and non-Europeans, are buying property in Spain as a holiday home or to live in. They're not buying them to make a quick buck.
Stephen, to you, I mean, it's part of people's dream, isn't it, to have a holiday home abroad, to have worked so long and saved so sufficiently to be able to buy a holiday home in Spain. Do you think that dream, if Pedro Sanchez has his way, will still exist for people, that Spain will suddenly just, for a lot of non-EU residents, be impossible to buy in?
I think it depends which end of the scale you're looking at. I think for the super rich, it won't really matter as much if they're fixated on Spain. I think there's a difference that should be drawn between residential purchases, which are for personal use, and those for investment. And I think that's been borne out by what Brian and Alex said. After all, we live in a global marketplace. There's huge competition for second homes to be located in these countries. I think Turkey being an obvious example, as well as Portugal, Italy and Greece in Southern Europe. Yeah, I think that it's more about the feeling, I think, as much as the money. But obviously, ultimately, the bottom pound will count.
And Stephen, from what you're hearing, do you think they would have been better off targeting, the kind of investors who are so greedy, they're hoovering up 500 places in Tenerife, rather than someone who has worked 35 years and has had a lifelong drive to go and get that little apartment in somewhere like Tenerife, La Gomera, one of the beautiful places in the Canaries?
That would seem society in terms of social consequence, much fairer, absolutely. But it's a question of the tax laws they draw up, and that's something for the left-wing government to decide in Spain.
Pablo, to you, the Spanish government, we know, famously, your parliament is fragmented. Sanchez has had a rocky ride the last couple of years. Will he get this through?
Yeah, that is a big question. I think this law and this proposal really is political in nature, right? And its aim is it's talking to the Spanish audience, it's talking to the Spanish electorate here. And they're saying, we're taking this very, very seriously. This is a big issue. And the government, Pedro Sanchez's government, has to do this because obviously last year was, as you said, rocky at the very least for Pedro Sanchez and his government. So the politics of Spain are in a particular fragile moment. And it has to be seen that he's taken a step forward, that he's trying to not just react to circumstances, but he's trying to actually propose a solution. And it's a clever political move because whatever the opposition parties say, if they block this law, Pedro Sanchez can easily go and say, you see, I tried to solve the problem. It was the opposition parties who do not want to solve this problem. And the issue of housing, as I said again, is one that brings pretty much everybody in Spain together. Everybody realizes and everybody knows that there is an issue with housing. I don't think this is going to solve the problem, far from it. But I do think it's signaling that the government is taking this very, very seriously and is listening to the electorate. If the opposition decides to block this law, then they're going to have to come up with some sort of better solution to the problem. And I think that's where they're going to struggle. So, I don't know, only time will tell. Spanish politics are notoriously complicated and complex. Anything can happen in the next couple of weeks. But I think it has a chance of going through Parliament, yes.
And tell me, just briefly, the Spanish opposition, have they got any ideas themselves that don't involve taxing foreigners?
I think we're in a holding period, I would say, in terms of policies in Spain, where the right is not doing anything because they're just waiting for the left to implode to some extent and make mistakes. They're criticizing a lot, but then they need to propose something. So I think it's a clever political move from Pedro Sanchez. I don't think, and I cannot think of a different alternative. And yes, I agree that it may be fairer to target specific people who are buying these houses for short-term rentals, but the reality is you cannot know why somebody's buying a property at a particular moment in time, so you have to do more general laws, I suppose, that are less complicated to some extent.
Brian, what advice would you give to any of your British compatriots right now who are watching and are concerned, lifelong dream of a property in Spain, and now they're thinking this won't be possible for us? What advice would you give people?
Well, if you're planning on retiring to Spain, then obviously apply for residency. There's several channels you can still, UK citizens can still apply. If you've got residency, then this proposed 100% tax won't apply to you.
Alex, business, as you said earlier on, business loves certainty. So what do you think 2025 is going to bring for your industry then? All this uncertainty can't be good.
Yeah, I think, it's a slap in the face to the residential property market. Basically, in 2023, there were 638,000 sales. More or less 19% of those went to foreigners, of which 4% went to non-Europeans. So really, we're only talking about 27,000 non-Europeans bought property. I think, I agree with what Pablo said. Pedro Sanchez is making a big political message about this. Whether he gets it through is seriously in doubt. At the beginning of the year, I was expecting a very strong year for us again, because all the variables in place. You've got actually, we act for clients buying properties of say 3.5 million euros in Marbella or Ibiza or Mallorca, which the locals won't be buying. But we also act for clients buying 40,000 euro properties in interior villages in Malaga, where people are actually leaving those townhouses and moving into the cities. So, us Brits, principally, we do travel. We do actually repopulate some of these towns and bring life to them. I was out for dinner last week in a local town, and all the people in that restaurant that night, which is a Spanish-owned restaurant, were foreigners. There might have been one table of Spaniards there. So, the tourist areas, mainly Costa del Sol, Costa Blanca, the Canary Islands and the Balearics, rely on tourism. And this law is not good news for tourism, because it's saying to the tourists, we actually don't want you here and we don't want you to buy a property here.
Stephen, do you think then, on the money side of things, that Pedro Sanchez and his government have really thought this through?
Yes. Ultimately, I question whether or not it will go through as it's been telegraphed, meaning 100% tax on the value of the property. I think that it scores an own goal in terms of the feeling, the projection it gives to non-EU tourists, and perhaps also other tourists. I think that it doesn't seem to have been properly thought through. And Alex has brought out some of the salient facts and figures there. And I wonder why ultimately other EU citizens who are not resident of Spain should not be taxed in the same way, because they also contribute to the second home crisis.
Thanks, Stephen. Pablo, a lot of discussion about this golden visa that Sanchez wants to get rid of. What is it? How does it work? How do you get one?
It was basically this idea that, again, I think it was introduced in 2014, right after the financial crisis and the burst of the housing bubble in Spain, really. And the idea was that if you invested more than €500,000, so you buy property for more than €500,000, you immediately get residency and you could reside in Spain. So it was an easy way for a lot of foreigners, mainly from Latin America and other parts of the world, to get residence permits to move to Spain. And I think it's part of the same measure, the same package to say, no more, we want housing in Spain to go primarily to Spanish people. And I think, again, that probably is a less controversial measure. And I think that's one of all these laws and all these packages are different sort of set of laws. So some of it may go through Congress, some of it may not. So I think this is one of the things that may go through Congress. And I think it's relatively easy to say why this is less controversial to some extent. The 100% tax, I think, is a big issue. I don't know if it will go through. I still have a sneaky feeling that it might, because, again, in Spain, they're all playing politics here. And that's the most important thing of the game. The priority of the government of this year, I would say, is survival, right? They have to survive. And to survive, they have to be seen to plan in the long term. Pedro Sanchez is very good reacting in crisis mode and short-term politics. He's excellent in those sort of things. I think one of the criticisms is he doesn't plan ahead. So he doesn't have a big plan for the future of Spain. So I think that's part of that agenda from Pedro Sanchez, that he has a plan to solve the big questions in Spain, particularly the housing crisis. And I don't think the opposition has really an alternative plan other than this. So this may not be the best idea, but it's the only idea on the table.
Brian, just talking about planning, I mean, Spain's a huge country, but all of the holiday apartments and villas that British people in particular are interested in, as we've heard from Alex, they're in the Costa Blanca, the Costa Brava, the Canaries. I mean, is it a case that maybe with a bit more clever planning, they could populate other areas and get people buying there too?
This is a possibility. One issue you've got on the islands is it's a limited territory. It's not a continent. And practically all the islands which are inhabited or used by as tourist destinations are basically over-constructed now. There's not much scope to build anything else. So what you're talking about is possibly in these areas and the more populated areas of Costa del Sol, Alicante, these areas, you're talking about reselling, possibly. There's not a lot of scope for new buildings. There is new constructions taking place in some areas, but I think the real issue is the reselling of business. If I may say as well, from the point of view of a lot of Spanish people here, Pedro Sanchez, he's a bit of a Marmite figure. People love him or they hate him, but they all appreciate that he's very, very determined. And the general consensus is that for once, it's the first time regarding housing that a politician is doing something in their favour and not in the favour of business.
Thank you, Brian. Final point to you, Alex, just briefly. If you were to run into Pedro Sanchez in the street, what message would you give him on behalf of your industry?
I would say to Pedro Sanchez that he's an admirable politician, but basically he needs to think through this law much more carefully, because if he starts taxing non-Europeans a much higher percentage of tax compared to Europeans, he will fall into the same trap that previous Spanish governments are falling into. And they got taken to the European Commission and they had their knuckles rapped and they had to treat non-Europeans and Europeans exactly the same when it comes to taxes. That happened on succession tax, so inheritance taxes. The Spanish government was charging non-Europeans more taxes to inherit Spanish assets than Europeans. And that got taken to the European Commission, and the law got changed. So I see this law as seriously discriminatory, and I would say that to Pedro Sanchez if I met him for a coffee.
Alex, Stephen, Brian and Pablo, muchas gracias. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all of the team here, goodbye, and thank you for watching.